I was stunned when I read it. With the aid of General Bedell Smith, he prevailed on Eisenhower to delay the message 24 hours. Eisenhower agreed with great reluctance. Returning to Montgomery's headquarters, de Guingand bluntly laid the facts before the field marshal. "I told Monty that I had seen Ike's message," de Guingand said, "and that, in effect, it said it is either me or Monty." Montgomery was shocked. De Guingand had never seen him so lonely and deflated. He looked up at his chief of staff and said quietly, "Freddie, what do you think I should do?" De Guingand had already drafted a message. Using this as a basis, Montgomery sent Eisenhower a thoroughly soldierly dispatch in which he made clear that he had no desire to be insubordinate. "Whatever your decision may be," he said, "you can rely on me 100%. The message was signed, "Your very devoted subordinate, Monty." There the matter had ended, for the moment anyhow. But now, at his headquarters in Reims, on this day of decision, March 28, 1945, Eisenhower was hearing again the distinct echo of an old refrain, not the agitation for a land forces commander once more, but the older, more basic issue, single thrust versus broad front. Without conferring with Eisenhower, Montgomery had, in his own words, issued orders to field commanders for the operations eastwards, and now hoped to make a single great push toward the Elbe and Berlin, obviously intending to enter the capital in a blaze of glory. The fact was that in making the main thrust north of the Ruhr, Montgomery was actually following agreed strategy, the Eisenhower plan approved by the combined chiefs of staff at Malta in January. What Montgomery now proposed was simply a logical extension of that drive, a move that would carry him to Berlin. If he was acting in haste, his eagerness was understandable. Like Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Brooke, Montgomery believed that time was running out, that the war might be lost politically unless Anglo-American forces reached Berlin before the Russians. The Supreme Commander, on the other hand, had received no policy directive from his superiors in Washington, reflecting this British sense of urgency. And although he was commander of the Allied forces, Eisenhower still took his orders from the U.S. War Department. In the absence of any redefinition of policy from Washington, his objective remained the same, the defeat of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. And, as he now saw it, the method by which he could most quickly achieve that military objective had changed radically since the presentation of his plans to the combined chiefs of staff in January. Originally, under Eisenhower's plan, General Bradley's 12th Army Group in the center was to have a limited role, supplementing Montgomery's main effort in the north. But who could have foreseen the spectacular successes achieved by Bradley's armies since the beginning of March? Good fortune and brilliant leadership had produced dazzling results. Even before Montgomery's massive Rhine assault, the U.S. First Army had captured the Remagen Bridge and had quickly crossed the river. Farther south, Patton's Third Army had slipped across the Rhine almost unimpeded. Since then, Bradley's forces had been on a rampage, going from victory to victory. Their achievements had fired the imagination of the U.S. public, and Bradley was now seeking a larger role in the final campaign. In this respect, Bradley and his generals were no different from Montgomery. They, too, wanted the prestige and glory of ending the war, and, if they got the chance, of capturing Berlin. At the right moment, Eisenhower had promised, he would launch one massive drive to the east, but he had not specified what group or groups would make the final thrust. Now, before making a decision, Eisenhower had to consider a variety of factors, all of which affected the design of his final campaign. The first of these was the unexpected speed of the Russian advance to the Oder. At the time, the Supreme Commander formulated his plans for the Rhine assault and Montgomery's offensive north of the Ruhr. It looked as if months might pass before the Russians got to within striking distance of Berlin. But now the Red Army was barely 38 miles from the city, while British and American forces were still more than 200 miles away. How soon would the Russians launch their offensive? Where and how did they intend to mount the attack, with Zhukov's army group in the center opposite Berlin, or with all three groups simultaneously? What was their estimate of the German strength opposing them, and how long would it take the Red Army to break through those defences? And, after they crossed the Oder, how long would it take the Soviets to reach and capture Berlin? The Supreme Commander could not answer these questions, all of them vitally important in his planning. The simple truth was that Eisenhower knew almost nothing of the Red Army's intentions. There was no day-to-day military coordination between Anglo-American and Soviet commanders in the field. There was not even a direct radio link between Shaeff and the Anglo-American military liaison mission in Moscow. All messages between the two fronts were funneled through normal diplomatic channels, a method totally inadequate now because of the speed of events. Although Eisenhower knew the Russians' approximate strength, he had no idea of their battle order. Apart from occasional data collected from various intelligence sources, most of it of doubtful accuracy, Shaeff's chief source of information on Russian moves was the Soviet communique broadcast each evening by the BBC. One fact, however, was clear. The Red Army had almost reached Berlin. With the Russians so close, should the Supreme Commander try for the city at all? The problem had many dimensions. The Russians had been on the Oder for more than 2 months, and with the exception of some local advances and patrol activity, they appeared to have come to a full stop. Their lines of supply and communications must be stretched to the utmost, and it hardly seemed likely that they could attack until after the spring thaw. Meanwhile, the Western armies, moving at astonishing speeds, were driving deeper and deeper into Germany. At places, they were averaging better than 35 miles per day. The Supreme Commander had no intention of letting up, no matter what Russian plans were, but he was reluctant to enter into a contest with the Russians for Berlin. That might prove not only embarrassing for the loser, but, in the event of an unexpected meeting between the onrushing armies, catastrophic for both forces. A headlong collision involving the Russians had occurred once before, when they were allied by treaty with the Germans. In 1939, after Hitler's undeclared blitzkrieg into Poland and the subsequent division of that country between Germany and Russia, Wehrmacht troops advancing east had smashed head-on into Red Army forces racing west. No prearranged line of demarcation had been established. The result was a minor battle, with fairly heavy casualties on both sides. A similar clash could occur now, but between the Anglo-Americans and the Russians, and on a much larger scale. It was a nightmarish thought. Wars had been set off by less. Obviously, coordination of movement had to be effected with the Russians, and quickly. Furthermore, there was one tactical problem that hung over Eisenhower like a thunderhead. In the great map room near his office, there was a carefully drawn intelligence chart bearing the legend, "Reported National Redoubt." It showed an area of mountainous territory lying south of Munich and straddling the alpine regions of Bavaria, western Austria, and northern Italy. In all, it covered almost 20,000 square miles. Its heart was Berchtesgaden. On the nearby Obersalzberg, surrounded by peaks 7,000 to 9,000 feet high, each studded with concealed anti-aircraft guns, was Hitler's mountaintop hideaway, the Eagle's Nest. Covering the map's face was a rash of red marks, each one a military symbol denoting some kind of defense installation. There were food, ammunition, gasoline and chemical warfare dumps, radio and power stations, troop concentration points, barracks and headquarters, zigzagging lines of fortified positions, ranging from pillboxes to massive concrete bunkers, even bomb-proof underground factories. Each day now, more and more symbols were added to the chart, and though all of them were labelled unconfirmed, to Shaeff this formidable mountain defence system was the greatest threat remaining in the European war. The area was sometimes referred to as the Alpenfestung, Alpine Fortress, or the National Redoubt. In this craggy citadel, according to intelligence, the Nazis, with Hitler at their head, intended to make a last-ditch Wagnerian stand. The rugged stronghold was considered almost impregnable, and its fanatical defenders might hold out for as long as 2 years. There was another, even more chilling aspect. Specially trained commando-type forces, Goebbels called them werewolves, were expected to sally out from the Alpine bastion and create havoc among the occupation armies. Did the Alpenfestung really exist? In Washington, the military seemed to think so. Information had been accumulating ever since September 1944, when the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in a general study of southern Germany, predicted that as the war neared its end, the Nazis would probably evacuate certain government departments to Bavaria. Since then, intelligence reports and appreciations had poured in, from the field, from neutral countries, even from sources inside Germany. Most of these evaluations were guarded, but some bordered on the fantastic. The Southern Redoubt. This map was drawn up at Supreme Headquarters to show the so-called defences, which existed only in the minds of Allied intelligence officers. The details of non-existent ammunition dumps and defence lines were so believable that the map played a large part in decisions made at the end of the war. Since the Allied forces have crossed the Rhine, wrote one high-level intelligence officer, the Germans are, I am sure, planning to make a major stand in the Bavarian Alps. The Germans have never, in the past, made a final stand in open country. There are many indications that this time they will attempt to make a last, desperate stand in the mountains. Eisenhower, however, was unimpressed. He had recently returned from a trip to the Southern Front, and in his estimate the Germans were using the Alps only as a refuge. "It is a mountainous region," he said, "but there are no special defences there." While this assertion could not be substantiated, he was inclined to disregard the reports about the alleged redoubt. One fact, however, was clear. Any movement toward that area would entail extremely difficult terrain and combat in an uncharted region. This was the last thing the Supreme Commander needed now, with the European war drawing to a close and other important matters requiring his attention. Although Eisenhower had accepted part of Marshall's recommendations, his moves were similar to those suggested by General Bradley's 12th Army Group in its Reorientation of Strategy memorandum. However, all three of Eisenhower's cables on his campaign plans had one significant omission: the objective which the Supreme Commander had once referred to as clearly the main prize. There was no mention of Berlin. The battered Brandenburg Gate loomed large in the dusk. From his villa nearby, Dr. Joseph Goebbels stared out at the monument through the partly boarded-up windows of his study. Almost contemptuously, Hitler's gnome-like propaganda chief had turned his back on his visitors. At least so it appeared to the man speaking, the Berlin commandant, Major General Helmut Rehmann. The general was trying to get a decision on the one matter he considered of the utmost urgency: the fate of the city's population on this eve of battle. It was the fourth time within a month that Rehmann and his chief of staff, Colonel Hans Refior, had met with Goebbels. Next to Hitler, the 47-year-old Goebbels was now the most important man in Berlin. He was not only Reichsminister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, but also Gauleiter of Berlin. As such, he was a Reich Defense Commissioner, responsible for all measures regarding the city's civilian population, the organization and training of Home Guard units, and the construction of fortifications. At a time when the absence of any clearly defined division of authority between the military and civilian agencies was creating trouble for soldiers and civil leaders alike, Goebbels had added to the confusion. Though he was totally ignorant of military or municipal matters, he had made it quite clear that he alone was assuming responsibility for defending Berlin. As a result, Rehmann found himself in an impossible position. From whom was he to take his orders? From Hitler's military headquarters, or from Goebbels? He was not sure, and no one seemed eager to clarify the command position. Rehmann was desperate. At each of the previous meetings, he had raised the issue of evacuation. At first, Goebbels said that it was out of the question. Then he informed the general that a scheme did exist, prepared by higher SS authorities and the police. Rehmann's chief of staff had promptly investigated. Refior had indeed found a plan. It consists, he told Rehmann, of a map, scale 1 to 300,000, on which the responsible official, a police captain, has neatly marked evacuation routes running out of Berlin to the west and south with red ink. There were, he reported, no sanitation stations, no food points, no transportation for the sick or weak. He added that, "As far as I can see, the plan calls for evacuees to set out along these roads with only hand luggage, march 20th to 30 kilometers to entraining stations where they will be transported to Thüringen, Sachsen-Anhalt and Mecklenburg. All this is supposed to take place when Goebbels presses a button, but exactly where the rail transport is to come from has not been made clear. Rehmann tried to discuss the matter with Hitler. He had seen him only twice, on assuming command and a few days later when he was invited to attend one of the Führer's nightly conferences. At that meeting, the discussion was mostly about the Oder front, and Rehmann did not get an opportunity to explain the situation in Berlin. But at one point during a lull in the proceedings, he spoke to Hitler and urged that he immediately order the evacuation of all children under 10 from the capital. In the sudden silence that followed Rehmann's suggestion, Hitler turned toward him and asked icily, "What do you mean? What exactly do you mean?" Then, slowly, emphasizing each word, he said, "There are no children in that age group left in Berlin." No one had dared contradict him. Hitler quickly passed on to other matters. The rebuff did not deter the Berlin commandant. Rehmann now pressed Goebbels on the same subject. "Herr Reichsminister," he said, "how will we support the population in the event of a siege? How will we feed them? Where is the food to come from? According to the mayor's statistics, there are 110,000 children under 10 with their mothers in the city right now. How are we to provide babies with milk?" Rehmann paused, waiting for an answer. Goebbels continued to stare out the window. Then, without turning, he snapped, "How will we feed them? We'll bring livestock in from the surrounding countryside. That's how we'll feed them. As for the children, we have a 3-month supply of canned milk." The canned milk was news to Rehmann and Refior. The livestock proposal seemed madness. In a battle, cows would prove more vulnerable than human beings, who could at least take shelter. Where did Goebbels plan to herd the animals, and what would they feed on? Rehmann spoke up earnestly. "Surely we must consider an immediate evacuation plan. We cannot wait any longer. Each day that passes will multiply the difficulties later on. We must at least move out the women and children now, before it's too late." Goebbels did not answer. There was a long silence. Outside it was growing dark. Suddenly he reached up, grabbed a cord by the window and yanked it. The blackout curtains closed with a rattle. Goebbels turned. Club-footed from birth, he limped across to his desk, snapped on the light, looked at the watch lying on the blotting pad, and then at Rehmann. "My dear General," he said mildly, "when and if an evacuation becomes necessary, I will be the one to make the decision." Then he snarled, "But I don't intend to throw Berlin into panic by ordering it now. There's plenty of time, plenty of time." He dismissed them. "Good evening, gentlemen." As Rehmann and Refior left the building, they paused for a moment on the steps. General Rehmann gazed out over the city. Although the sirens had not sounded, in the far distance searchlights had begun fingering the night sky. As Rehmann slowly pulled on his gloves, he said to Refior, "We are faced with a task that we cannot solve, that has no chance of success. I can only hope that some miracle happens to change our fortunes, or that the war ends before Berlin comes under siege." He looked at his chief of staff. "Otherwise," he added, "God help the Berliners." A short while later, at his command post on the Hohenzollern-Damm, Rehmann received a call from the OKH, Army High Command. Besides the Supreme Commander Hitler and the Berlin Gauleiter, Goebbels, Rehmann now learned that he was subordinated to yet another authority. Arrangements were being made, he was told, for the Berlin defense area to come eventually under the direction of the Army Group Vistula and its commander, Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici. Rehmann felt the first stirrings of hope at reading Heinrici's name. He directed Refior to brief the Army Group Vistula staff at the earliest opportunity. There was only one thing that worried him. He wondered how Heinrici would feel about taking Berlin under his wing while at the same time preparing to hold the Russians on the Oder. Rehmann knew Heinrici well. He could imagine the Giftswerg's reaction when he heard the news. "It's absurd," growled Heinrici. "Absurd." Army Group Vistula's new Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eberhard Kinzel, and its operations chief, Colonel Hans Eismann, looked at each other and remained silent. There was nothing to say. Absurd seemed an understatement. The proposal to attach the Berlin defence area to Heinrichi's hard-pressed command at this particular moment seemed impossible to both officers. Neither could see how Heinrichi was supposed to direct or even oversee Reymann's defence operations. Distance alone made the plan impractical. Vistula's headquarters was more than 50 miles from Berlin, and it was clear that whoever had suggested the idea appeared to know very little about the staggering problems facing Heinrichi. Earlier in the evening, Operations Department officers of OKH, Army High Command, had carefully presented the Berlin defence proposal to Kinzel. The idea was put forth tentatively, almost as a suggestion. Now, as Heinrichi paced his office, the mud of the front still on his old-fashioned leggings, he made it plain to his subordinates that so far as he was concerned, the plan would remain just that, a suggestion. Army Group Vistula had one task: to stop the Russians on the Oder. "Unless I'm forced," said Heinrichi, "I do not intend to accept responsibility for Berlin." That did not mean he was unaware of the plight of the city's people. Indeed, the fate of Berlin's population of almost 3 million was often in Heinrichi's thoughts. He was haunted by the possibility of Berlin's becoming a battlefield. He knew better than most what happened to civilians caught in the fury of artillery fire and street fighting. He believed that the Russians were merciless, and in the heat of battle he did not expect them to discriminate between soldiers and civilians. Nevertheless, at this moment it was unthinkable that he should be expected to take on the problem of Berlin and its civilian population. The Army Group Vistula was the sole barrier between Berlin and the Russians, and as always Heinrichi's main concern was with his soldiers. The crusty, belligerent Giftswerk was furious at Hitler and the chief of OKH, Guderian, for what seemed to him the deliberate sacrifice of his soldiers' lives. Turning to Kinzel, he said, "Get me Guderian." Since assuming command a week before, Heinrichi had been constantly at the front. Tirelessly he had travelled from headquarters to headquarters, mapping out strategy with division commanders, visiting frontline troops in their dugouts and bunkers. He had quickly discovered that his suspicions were well-founded. His forces were armies in name only. He was appalled to find that most units had been fattened with splinter troops and the remnants of once proud divisions long since destroyed. Among his forces, Heinrichi even found non-German units. There were the Nordland and Nederland divisions, composed of pro-Nazi Norwegian and Dutch volunteers, and a formation of former Russian prisoners of war under the leadership of the erstwhile defender of Kiev, a distinguished soldier named Lieutenant General Andrei A. Vlasov. After his surrender in 1942, he had been persuaded to organize a pro-German anti-Stalinist Russian army. Vlasov's troops worried Heinrichi. It seemed to him that they were likely to desert at the slightest opportunity. Some of Heinrichi's panzer forces were in good shape, and he was depending greatly on them. But the overall picture was bleak. Intelligence reports indicated that the Russians might have as many as 3 million men. Between von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army in the north and Buss's 9th Army in the southern sector, Heinrichi had a total of about 482,000, and there were almost no reserves. Besides being desperately short of combat-tested troops, Heinrichi was handicapped by acute shortages of equipment and supplies. He needed tanks, motorized guns, communications equipment, artillery, gasoline, ammunition, even rifles. So short were supplies that Colonel Eismann, the operations officer, discovered that some replacements had arrived at the front with bazooka-like anti-tank weapons instead of rifles, and only one rocket projectile apiece for the weapons. "It's madness," Eismann told Heinrichi. "How are these men supposed to fight after they fire their one round? What does OKH expect them to do? Use their empty weapons like billy clubs? It's mass murder." Heinrichi agreed. "OKH expects the men to wait for what fate may bring them. I do not." By every means in his power, Heinrichi was trying to rectify his equipment and supply situation, even though some commodities had all but disappeared. His greatest lack was artillery. The Russians were beginning to construct bridges across the Oder and its marshy approaches. In some places, the flood-swollen river was more than 2 miles wide. Special naval forces attached to Heinrich's command had floated mines down the river to destroy the pontoons, but the Russians had promptly countered by erecting protective nets. Bombing the bridge construction from the air was out of the question. Luftwaffe officials had informed Heinrici that they had neither the aircraft nor the gasoline for the job. The most they could provide was single planes for reconnaissance missions. There was only one way left to stop the Russians' feverish bridge building: artillery, and Heinrici had precious little of that. To make up for this crippling shortage, he had ordered anti-aircraft guns to be used as field pieces. Although it meant less protection from Russian air attacks, Heinrici reasoned that the guns would be used to better advantage in the field, and indeed, the move had alleviated the situation. From the Stettin area alone, von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army acquired 600 flak guns. Each had to be set in concrete, for they were too large and unwieldy to be mounted on vehicles, but they were helping to fill out the gaps. Yet, though they stood menacingly in place, they fired only when absolutely necessary. The lack of ammunition was so severe that Heinrici was determined to husband what little he had for the opening of the Red Army's onslaught. Still, as he told his staff, "While we do not have enough guns or ammunition to stop the Russians building, at least we're slowing them up." Colonel Eismann viewed the situation more pessimistically. "The army group could be compared to a rabbit," he later recalled, "watching spellbound a snake which wants to devour him. He can't move a muscle, but waits for the moment when the snake will strike in a lightning-fast manner." General Heinrici did not want to admit the fact that the army group could not take any more meaningful measures on the basis of its own strength. Yet in just 1 week of command, Heinrici had bulldozed his way through scores of seemingly insurmountable difficulties. Like the Heinrici of Moscow, he had cajoled and goaded his troops, growled at and praised them in an effort to give them a fighting morale that would gain him time and help save their lives. Whatever his private feelings, to his officers and men he was the unintimidated, unbreakable Heinrici of legend. True to character, he was still fighting the madness and bad judgment of the higher command. Right now his fiery temper was directed at Hitler and the chief of OKH, Guderian. On March 23rd, General Busse's 9th Army had attacked twice in a desperate effort to break through to the isolated defenders of Kustrin, the city the Russians had encircled the day Heinrici had assumed command from Himmler. Heinrici had agreed to Busse's tactics, feeling they offered the only chance to free the city before the Russians consolidated their positions. However, the Russians were much too strong. Both attacks proved disastrous. Heinrici, reporting the outcome to Guderian, was told bluntly, "There must be another attack." Hitler wanted it. So did Guderian. "It's crazy," Heinrici replied stiffly. "I would suggest that the panzer units in Kustrin receive orders to break out. It's the only sensible thing left to do." Guderian flared at the proposal. "The attack must be mounted," he shouted. On March 27th, Busse once again threw his troops at Kustrin. The attack was so ferocious that some of his panzer forces actually broke through to the city. But then the Russians smashed the German drive with artillery fire. At staff headquarters, Heinrici minced no words. "The attack," he said, "is a massacre. The 9th Army has suffered incredible losses for absolutely nothing." Even now, the day after, his anger had not abated. As he waited for his call to Guderian, he paced his office muttering over and over the one word, "Fiasco." Regardless of what might happen to him personally, when Guderian came on the phone, Heinrici intended to charge his superior with the bloody massacre of 8,000 men. Nearly a division had been lost in the Kustrin attack. The phone rang and Kinzel answered. "It's Zossen," he told Heinrici. The smooth voice of Lieutenant General Hans Krebs, OKH Chief of Staff, was not what Heinrici expected. "I meant to talk to Guderian," he said. Krebs began speaking again. Heinrici's face hardened as he listened. The staff officers watching him wondered what was happening. When? asked Heinrici. He listened again, then abruptly said, "Thank you," and put down the phone. Turning to Kinzel and Eismann, Heinrici said quietly, "Guderian is no longer chief of OKH. Hitler relieved him of command this afternoon." To his astonished staff, Heinrici added, "Krebs says that Guderian is sick, but that he doesn't really know what happened." Heinrici's rage had completely evaporated. He made only one further observation. "It's not like Guderian," he said thoughtfully. "He didn't even say goodbye." It was late that night before Heinrici's staff was able to piece the story together. Guderian's dismissal had followed one of the wildest scenes ever witnessed in the Reichskanzlei. Hitler's midday conference had begun quietly enough, but there were undertones of barely repressed hostility. Guderian had written the Führer a memorandum explaining why the Kustrin attack had failed. Hitler disliked not only the tone Guderian adopted, but also Guderian's defence of the Ninth Army and of General Buss in particular. The Führer had settled on Busse as the scapegoat and had ordered him to attend the meeting and make a full report. As usual, Hitler's top military advisers were in attendance. In addition to Guderian and Busse, there were Hitler's chief of staff, Keitel, his operations chief, Jodl, the Führer's adjutant, Burgdorf, several other senior officers and various aides. For several minutes, Hitler listened to a general briefing on the current situation. Then Buss was invited to give his report. He began by briefly outlining how the attack was launched and the forces that were employed. Hitler began to show annoyance. Suddenly he interrupted. "Why did the attack fail?" he yelled. Without pausing, he answered his own question. "Because of incompetence, because of negligence." He heaped abuse on Buss, Guderian, and the entire High Command. They were all incompetent. "The Kustrin attack was launched," he ranted, "without sufficient artillery preparation." Then he turned on Guderian. "If Busse didn't have enough ammunition as you claim, why didn't you get him more?" There was a moment of silence. Then Guderian began to speak quietly. "I have already explained to you." Hitler, waving his arm, cut him off. "Explanations, excuses, that's all you give me," he shouted. "Well, then you tell me who let us down at Kustrin, the troops or Buss?" Guderian suddenly boiled. "Nonsense!" he spluttered. "This is nonsense!" He almost spat the words out. Furious, his face reddening, he launched into a tirade. "Busse is not to blame," he bellowed. "I've told you that. He followed orders. Buss used all the ammunition that was available to him, all that he had." Guderian's anger was monumental. He struggled for words. "To say that the troops are to blame! Look at the casualties!" he raged. "Look at the losses! The troops did their duty. Their self-sacrifice proves it." Hitler yelled back. "They failed!" he raged. "They failed!" Guderian, his face purpling, roared at the top of his voice. I must ask you not to level any further accusations at Busse or his troops." Both men were beyond reasonable discussion, but they did not stop. Facing each other, Guderian and Hitler engaged in such a furious and terrifying exchange that officers and aides stood frozen in shock. Hitler, lashing out at the general staff, called them all spineless, fools, and fatheads. He ranted that they had constantly misled, misinformed, and tricked him. Guderian challenged the Führer on his use of the words misinformed and misled. Had General Gehlen in his intelligence estimate misinformed about the strength of the Russians? "No!" roared Guderian. "Gehlen is a fool," Hitler retorted. "What of the surrounded 18 divisions still in the Baltic states, in Kurland?" "Who," barked Guderian, "has misled you about them? Exactly when," he demanded of the Führer, "do you intend to evacuate the Kurland army?" So loud and violent was the encounter that afterward no one could remember exactly the sequence of the quarrel. Even Buss, the innocent perpetrator of the argument, was unable to tell Heinrici later what had transpired in any detail. "We were almost paralyzed," he said. "We couldn't believe what was happening." Jodl was the first to snap into action. He grabbed the yelling Guderian by the arm. Please, please, he implored. Calm down. He pulled Guderian to one side. Keitel and Bergdorf began ministering to Hitler, who had slumped, exhausted, into a chair. Guderian's horrified aide, Major Freitag von Loringhoven, certain that his chief would be arrested if he did not get him immediately out of the room, ran outside and called Krebs, the chief of staff, at Zossen, and told him what was happening. Von Loringhoven implored Krebs to speak to Guderian on the phone, on the pretense that there was urgent news from the front, and to hold him in conversation until the general calmed down. With difficulty, Guderian was persuaded to leave the room. Krebs, a past master at the art of manipulating information to suit the occasion, had no trouble in claiming Guderian's undivided attention for more than 15 minutes, and by that time the chief of the Army High Command was in control of his emotions again. During the interval, the Führer had calmed down too. When Guderian returned, Hitler was conducting the conference as though nothing had happened. Seeing him enter, the Führer ordered everyone out of the room except Keitel and Guderian. Then he said coldly, "Colonel General Guderian, your physical health requires that you immediately take 6 weeks convalescent leave." His voice betraying no emotion, Guderian said, "I'll go." But Hitler was not quite finished. "Please wait until the conference is over," he ordered. It was several hours before the meeting broke up. By that time, Hitler was almost solicitous. "Please do your best to get your health back," he said. "In 6 weeks the situation will be very critical. Then I shall need you urgently. Where do you think you will go?" Keitel wanted to know too. Suspicious at their sudden concern, Guderian prudently decided not to tell them his plans. Excusing himself, he left the Reichskanzlei. Guderian was out. The innovator of the panzer techniques, the last of Hitler's big-name generals, was gone. With him went the last vestiges of sound judgment in the German High Command. By 6 a.m. the following morning, Thursday, March 29th, Heinrici had good reason to feel Guderian's loss. He had just been handed a teletyped message informing him that Hitler had appointed Krebs as chief of the OKH. Krebs was a smooth-talking man who was a fanatical supporter of Hitler. He was widely and cordially disliked. Among the Vistula staff, the news of his appointment, following so closely that of Guderian's departure, produced an atmosphere of gloom. The operations chief, Colonel Eismann, summed up the prevailing attitude. As he was later to record, "This man, with his eternally friendly smile, reminded me somehow of a faun. It was clear what we could expect. Krebs had only to spout out a few confident phrases, and the situation was rosy again. Hitler would get much better support from him than from Guderian." Heinrici made no comment on the appointment. Guderian's spirited defence of Buss had saved that commander, and there would be no more suicidal attacks against Kustrin. For that, Heinrici was grateful to a man with whom he had often disagreed. He would miss Guderian, for he knew Krebs of old and expected little support from him. There would be no outspoken Guderian to back up Heinrici when he saw Hitler to discuss the problems of the Oder front. He was to see the Führer for a full-dress conference on Friday, April 6th. The car pulled up outside Vistula's main headquarters building a little after 9 a.m. on March 29th, and the broad-shouldered, 6-foot Berlin chief of staff bounded out. The energetic Colonel Hans Teddy Refior was looking forward enthusiastically to his meeting with Heinrici's chief of staff, General Kinzel. He had high hopes that the conference would go well. Coming under Heinrici's command would be the best thing that could happen to the Berlin defence area. Lugging maps and charts for his presentation, the husky 39-year-old Refior entered the building. Small though the Berlin garrison was, Refior believed, as he later wrote in his diary, that Heinrici would be delighted at this increase in his forces. He had his first moments of doubt on meeting the Chief of Staff. Kinzel's greeting was restrained, though not unfriendly. Refior had hoped that his old classmate Colonel Eismann would be present. They had gone over the Berlin situation together a few weeks before, but Kinzel received him alone. The Vistula Chief of Staff seemed harassed, his manner bordering on impatience. Taking his cue from Kinzel, Refior opened his maps and charts and quickly began the briefing. The lack of a major authority to direct Rehmann had produced an almost impossible situation for the Berlin command, he explained. When we asked the OKH if we came under them, he elaborated, we were told the OKH is responsible only for the Eastern Front. You people come under the OKW, Armed Forces High Command. So we went to OKW. They said, why come to us? Berlin's front faces east. You are the responsibility of OKH. As Refior talked, Kinzel examined the maps and disposition of the Berlin forces. Suddenly, Kinzel looked up at Refior and quietly told him of Heinrichi's decision of the night before not to accept responsibility for the city's defence. Then, as Refior later recorded, Kinzel spoke briefly of Hitler, Goebbels, and the other bureaucrats. As far as I am personally concerned, he said, those madmen in Berlin can fry in their own juice. On the drive back to Berlin, Refior, his buoyant enthusiasm shattered, realized for the first time what it meant to be a rejected orphan. He loved Berlin. He had attended the War Academy, married and raised his 2 children, a boy and a girl, in the capital. Now it seemed to him that he was working in ever-increasing loneliness to defend the city in which he had spent the happiest years of his life. No one in the chain of command was prepared to make what Refior saw as the gravest of all decisions, the responsibility for the defence and preservation of Berlin. All that was left to do was to put the few possessions on his desk into a small case. He had said goodbye to his staff, briefed his successor Krebs, and now Colonel General Heinz Guderian was ready to leave his Zossen headquarters, his eventual destination a well-guarded secret. First, however, he intended to go with his wife to a sanatorium near Munich, where Guderian could get treatment for his ailing heart. Afterward, he planned to head for the only peaceful place left in Germany, southern Bavaria. The only activities in that region centered around army hospitals and convalescent homes, retired or dismissed generals, and evacuated government officials and their departments. The general had chosen carefully. He would sit out the war in the unwarlike climate of the Bavarian Alps. As former chief of the OKH, Guderian knew that absolutely nothing was happening down there. In 1948, following a sudden rise in pulse rate, his doctors told him to give up tobacco. Eisenhower never smoked again. His pride was somewhat restored when, shortly after this incident, the British showed their confidence in Montgomery and his policies by naming him a field marshal. For the man who had turned the tide of British defeat in the desert and chased Rommel out of North Africa, it was an honour long overdue. These figures were given by Winston Churchill on January 18, 1945, in a speech before the House of Commons. Appalled by the breakdown in amity, he announced that US troops have done almost all the fighting in the Ardennes, suffering losses equal to those of both sides at the Battle of Gettysburg. Then, in what could only be interpreted as a direct slap at Montgomery and his supporters, he warned the British not to lend themselves to the shouting of mischief-makers. I should never have held the press conference at all, Montgomery told the author in 1963. The Americans seemed oversensitive at the time, and many of their generals disliked me so much that no matter what I said, it would have been wrong. Montgomery, Eisenhower later stated, believed in the appointment of a field commander as a matter of principle. He even offered to serve under Bradley if I would approve. On March 11th, for example, Schaef intelligence reported that Zhukov's spearheads had reached Seelau, west of the Oder, and just 28 miles from Berlin. When the author interviewed Soviet defense officials in Moscow in 1963, he learned that Zhukov did not actually reach Seelau, in the center of the German Oder defense system, until April 17th. Whoever prepared the counterintelligence paper was in error about Barbarossa's last resting place. Barbarossa, Redbeard, the surname of Frederick They, 1121 to 1190, is not buried in Berchtesgaden. As the myth goes, he never died, but merely sleeps in the hills of Thuringia. He sits at a stone table with his 6 knights, waiting for the fullness of time when he will rescue Germany from bondage and give her the foremost place in the world. His beard has already grown through the stone slab, but it must wind itself thrice around the table before his second advent. One of Marshall's senior staff officers, General John Hull, who in 1945 was the U.S. Army's acting chief of staff for operations, says that Ike was Marshall's protégé, and though Ike might resent me saying this, there was between the two men a sort of father-son relationship. There are many versions of the row, ranging from a detailed report in Jürgen Thorwald's Flight in the Winter to a two-line account in Die letzten Tage der Reichskanzlei by Gerhard Bolt, one of Guderian's aides. Passing lightly over the matter, Bolt writes that Hitler advised the OKH chief to go to a spa for treatment, and Guderian took the hint. He gives the conference date as March 20th, 7 days before the fateful Kustrin attack. Guderian, in his memoirs Panzer Leader, gives the time and date as precisely 14 o'clock hours on March 28th. For the most part, my reconstruction is based on Guderian's memoirs, supplemented by interviews with Heinrici, Busse, and their respective staffs. It was Good Friday, March 30th, the beginning of the Easter weekend. In Warm Springs, Georgia, President Roosevelt had arrived for a stay at the Little White House. Near the railroad station, crowds stood in the hot sun, waiting, as always, to greet him. At the first appearance of the president, a murmur of surprise swept the onlookers. He was being carried from the train in the arms of a Secret Service man, almost inert, his body sagging. There was no jaunty wave, no good-humoured joke shared with the crowd. To many, Roosevelt seemed almost comatose, only vaguely aware of what was happening. Shocked and apprehensive, the people watched in silence as the presidential limousine moved slowly away. In Moscow, the weather was unseasonably mild. From his second-floor apartment in the embassy building on Mokovaya Street, Major General John R. Dean gazed out across the square at the green Byzantine domes and minarets of the Kremlin. Dean, the chief of the U.S. military mission, and his British counterpart, Admiral Ernest R. Archer, were awaiting confirmation from their respective ambassadors, W. Averell Harriman and Sir Archibald Clark Kerr, that a meeting with Stalin had been arranged. At that conference, they would deliver to Stalin SKF 252, the cable which had arrived from General Eisenhower the day before, and which the ailing U.S. president had not seen. In London, Winston Churchill, cigar jutting from his mouth, waved to onlookers outside number 10 Downing Street. He was preparing to leave by car for Chequers, the 700-acre official residence of British Prime Ministers in Buckinghamshire. Despite his cheerful appearance, Churchill was both worried and angry. Among his papers was a copy of the Supreme Commander's cable to Stalin. For the first time in almost 3 years of close cooperation, the Prime Minister was furious with Eisenhower. British reaction to Eisenhower's cable had been mounting for more than 24 hours. The British had been bewildered at first, then shocked, and finally angered. Like the combined chiefs of staff in Washington, London had learned of the message at second hand, through copies passed along for information. Not even the British Deputy Supreme Commander, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, had known of the cable beforehand. London had heard nothing from him. Churchill himself was caught completely off balance. Remembering Montgomery's signal of March 27th announcing his drive to the Elbe and thence by Autobahn to Berlin, I hope, the Prime Minister whipped off an anxious note to his Chief of Staff, General Sir Hastings Ismay. Eisenhower's message to Stalin, he wrote, seems to differ from Montgomery, who spoke of Elbe. Please explain. For the moment, Ismay could not. At that point, Montgomery gave his superiors another surprise. The powerful U.S. Ninth Army, he reported to Field Marshal Brooke, was to be switched back from his command to General Bradley's 12th Army Group, which would then make the central thrust to Leipzig and Dresden. "I consider we are about to make a terrible mistake," Montgomery said. Once again, the British were incensed. In the first place, such information should have come from Eisenhower, not Montgomery. But worse, the Supreme Commander seemed to London to be taking too much into his own hands. In the British view, he had not only stepped far beyond his authority by dealing directly with Stalin, but he had also changed long-standing plans without warning. Instead of attacking across Germany's northern plains with Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which had been specially built up for the offensive, Eisenhower had suddenly tapped Bradley to make the last drive of the war through the heart of the Reich. Brooke bitterly summed up the British attitude. To start with, Eisenhower has no business to address Stalin direct. His communications should be through the combined chiefs of staff. Secondly, he produced a telegram which was unintelligible, and finally, what was implied in it appeared to be a drift and a change from all that had been agreed on. On the afternoon of March 29th, an irate Brooke, without consulting Churchill, fired off a sharp protest to Washington. A bitter and vitriolic debate was slowly building up about SCAF 252. At about the same time, General Dean in Moscow, having taken the first steps to arrange a meeting with Stalin, sent an urgent cable to Eisenhower. Dean wanted some additional background information in case Stalin wishes to discuss your plans in more detail. After months of frustrating dealings with the Russians, Dean knew full well what the Generalissimo would ask for, and he spelled it all out for Eisenhower. 1. The present composition of armies. 2. A little more detail on the scheme of manoeuvre. 3. Which army or armies you envisage making the main and secondary advances. 4. Brief current estimate of enemy dispositions and intentions. Scharf quickly complied. At 8:15 that night, the intelligence was on its way to Moscow. Dean got the composition of the Anglo-American armies and their order of battle from north to south. So detailed was the information that it even included the fact that the U.S. Ninth Army was to revert back from Montgomery to Bradley. 51 minutes later, Scharf heard from Montgomery. He was understandably distressed. With the loss of Simpson's army, the strength of his drive was sapped, and his chance of triumphantly capturing Berlin seemed gone. But he still hoped to persuade Eisenhower to delay the transfer. He sent an unusually tactful message. "I note," he said, "that you intend to change the command setup. If you feel this is necessary, I pray you not to do so until we reach the Elbe, as such action would not help the great movement which is now beginning to develop." Montgomery's British superiors were in no mood to be tactful, as Washington officials quickly discovered. At the Pentagon, Brooke's protest was formally delivered to General Marshall by the British representative to the combined Chiefs of Staff, Field Marshal Sir Henry Maitland Wilson. The British note condemned the procedure Eisenhower had adopted in communicating with Stalin and charged that the Supreme Commander had changed plans. Marshall, both surprised and concerned, promptly radioed Eisenhower. His message was mainly a straightforward report on the British protest. It argued, he said, that existing strategy should be followed, that Montgomery's northern drive would secure the German ports and thereby, to a great extent, annul the U-boat war, and that it would also free Holland, Denmark, and open up communications with Sweden again, making available nearly 2 million tons of Swedish and Norwegian shipping now lying idle in Swedish ports. The British chiefs, Marshall quoted, feel strongly that the main thrust across the open plains of NW Germany with the object of capturing Berlin should be adhered to. To fend off Eisenhower's British critics and to patch up Anglo-American unity as quickly as possible, Marshall was prepared to give latitude and understanding to both sides. Yet his own puzzlement and annoyance with the Supreme Commander's actions showed through the last paragraph of his message. Prior to your dispatch of SCAF 252 had the naval aspects of the British been considered. He ended with, "Your comments are requested as a matter of urgency." One man above all others felt urgency, and, indeed, impending chaos in the situation. Winston Churchill's anxiety had been mounting almost hourly. The Eisenhower incident had arisen at a moment when relations among the three allies were not going well. It was a critical period, and Churchill felt very much alone. He did not know how ill Roosevelt was, but for some time previous he had been puzzled and uneasy about his correspondence with the President. As he was later to put it, "In my long telegrams I thought I was talking to my trusted friend and colleague, but I was no longer being fully heard by him. Various hands drafted in combination the answers which were sent in his name. Roosevelt could only give general guidance and approval. These were costly weeks for all. Even more worrisome was the rapid political deterioration that was evident between the West and Russia. Churchill's suspicions about Stalin's post-war aims had grown steadily since Yalta. The Soviet premier had contemptuously disregarded the promises made there. Nearly every day now, new and ominous trends appeared. Eastern Europe was slowly being swallowed up by the USSR. Anglo-American bombers, downed behind Red Army lines because of fuel or mechanical problems, were being interned along with their crews. Air bases and facilities promised by Stalin for the use of American bombers had been suddenly denied. The Russians, granted free access to liberated prisoner-of-war camps in Western Germany for the repatriation of their troops, refused similar permission to Western representatives to enter, evacuate, or in any way aid Anglo-American soldiers in Eastern European camps. Worse, Stalin had charged that Soviet ex-prisoners of war in US camps were subjected to unfair treatment and unlawful persecution, including beating. When the Germans in Italy tried to negotiate secretly the surrender of their forces, Russian reaction was to fire off an insulting note accusing the Allies of treacherously dealing with the enemy behind the back of the Soviet Union, which is bearing the brunt of the war. And now had come the Eisenhower message to Stalin. At a time when the choice of military objectives might well determine the future of post-war Europe, Churchill considered that Eisenhower's communication with the Soviet dictator constituted a dangerous intervention into global and political strategy, realms that were strictly the concern of Roosevelt and the Prime Minister. To Churchill, Berlin was of crucial political importance, and it now looked as though Eisenhower did not intend to make an all-out effort to capture the city. Before midnight on March 29th, Churchill had called Eisenhower on the scrambler telephone and asked for a clarification of the Supreme Commander's plans. The Prime Minister carefully avoided mentioning the Stalin cable. Instead, he stressed the political significance of Berlin and argued that Montgomery should be allowed to continue the northern offensive. It was of paramount importance, Churchill felt, that the Allies capture the capital before the Russians. Now, on this March 30th, as he began the 60-odd-mile drive to Chequers, he pondered Eisenhower's answer with profound concern. Berlin, the Supreme Commander had said, is no longer a major military objective. In Reims, Dwight Eisenhower's temper was mounting in pace with the British protests. The London reaction to the curbing of Montgomery's northern drive had surprised him by its vehemence, but more astonishing to Eisenhower was the storm raging over his cable to Stalin. He could see no reason for any controversy. He believed his action was both correct and militarily essential, and he was incensed to find his decision challenged. Short-tempered at best, Eisenhower was now the angriest Allied leader of all. On the morning of March 30th, he began to respond to the messages from Washington and London. His first move was to send a brief acknowledgement of Marshall's overnight cable. He promised a more detailed answer within a few hours, but for the moment simply stated that he had not changed plans and that the British charge has no possible basis in fact. My plan will get the ports and all the other things on the north coast more speedily and decisively than will the dispersion now urged upon me by Wilson's message to you. Next, in reply to the Prime Minister's nighttime telephone request, he sent Churchill additional details clarifying the orders which had been issued Montgomery. Subject to Russian intentions, a central drive to Leipzig and Dresden under Bradley's command seemed called for because it would cut the German armies approximately in half and destroy the major part of the remaining enemy forces in the west. Once its success was assured, Eisenhower intended to take action to clear the northern ports. Montgomery, said the Supreme Commander, would be responsible for these tasks, and I propose to increase his forces if that should seem necessary. Once the above requirements have been met, Eisenhower planned to send General Devers and his 6th Army Group southeast toward the redoubt area to prevent any possible German consolidation in the south and to join hands with the Russians in the Danube Valley. The Supreme Commander closed by remarking that his present plans were flexible and subject to changes to meet unexpected situations. Berlin was not mentioned. Eisenhower's message to the Prime Minister was restrained and correct. It did not reflect his anger. But his fury was clearly evident in the detailed cable he sent, as promised earlier, to Marshall. Eisenhower told the U.S. Chief of Staff that he was completely in the dark as to what the protest concerning procedure involved. I have been instructed to deal directly with the Russians concerning military coordination. As for his strategy, Eisenhower insisted again that there was no change. The British Chiefs of Staff last summer, he said, always protested against my determination to open up the central route because they said it would be futile and draw strength away from a northern attack. I have always insisted that the northern attack would be the principal effort in the isolation of the Ruhr, but from the very beginning, extending back before D-Day, my plan has been to link up primary and secondary efforts, and then make one great thrust to the eastward. Even cursory examination shows that the principal effort should be toward the Leipzig region, in which area is concentrated the greater part of the remaining German industrial capacity, and to which area German ministries are believed to be moving. Harking back to the old Montgomery Brook agitation for a single thrust strategy, Eisenhower said, "Merely following the principle that Field Marshal Brooke has always shouted to me, I am determined to concentrate on one major thrust, and all that my plan does is to place the 9th U.S. Army back under Bradley for that phase of operations involving the advance of the centre. The plan clearly shows that 9th Army may again have to move up to assist the British and Canadian armies in clearing the whole coastline to the westward of Lübeck. Afterward, we can launch a movement to the southeastward to prevent Nazi occupation of the mountain citadel." The National Redoubt, which Eisenhower called the Mountain Citadel, was now clearly a major military goal, of more concern, in fact, than Berlin. "May I point out," the Supreme Commander said, "that Berlin itself is no longer a particularly important objective. Its usefulness to the German has been largely destroyed, and even his government is preparing to move to another area. What is now important is to gather up our forces for a single drive, and this will more quickly bring about the fall of Berlin, the relief of Norway, and the acquisition of the shipping and the Swedish ports than will the scattering around of our effort." By the time Eisenhower reached the final paragraph of his message, his anger at the British was barely contained. "The Prime Minister and his Chiefs of Staff," he declared, "opposed Anvil, the invasion of southern France. They opposed my idea that the Germans should be destroyed west of the Rhine before we made our great effort across the river, and they insisted that the route leading northeastward from Frankfurt would involve us merely in slow, rough country fighting. Now they apparently want me to turn aside on operations, in which would be involved many thousands of troops before the German forces are fully defeated. I submit that these things are studied daily and hourly by me and my advisers, and that we are animated by one single thought, which is the early winning of this war." In Washington, later that day, General Marshall and the combined Chiefs of Staff received an amplification of the British Chiefs of Staff protest of the day before. For the most part, the second telegram was a lengthy reiteration of the first, but there were two important additions. In the interim, the British had learned from Admiral Archer in Moscow of the supplementary intelligence forwarded from Schaeff to Dean. The British strongly urged that this information be withheld from the Russians. In the event that discussions had already begun, London wanted the talks suspended until the combined Chiefs of Staff had reviewed the situation. But by now, the British were beginning to disagree among themselves, not just over the propriety of the Eisenhower message, but over which parts of it should be attacked. The British Chiefs of Staff had neglected to show Churchill their protests before sending them off to Washington, and Churchill's objections differed from those of his military advisers. To him, the main criticism of the new Eisenhower plan is that it shifts the axis of the main advance upon Berlin to the direction through Leipzig and Dresden. As the Prime Minister saw it, under this plan British forces might be condemned to an almost static role in the north. Worse, all prospect also of the British entering Berlin with the Americans is ruled out. Berlin, as always now, was uppermost in the Prime Minister's thoughts. It seemed to him that Eisenhower may be wrong in supposing Berlin to be largely devoid of military or political importance. Although government departments had, to a great extent, moved to the south, the dominating fact on German minds of the fall of Berlin should not be overlooked. He was haunted by the danger involved in neglecting Berlin and leaving it to the Russians. He declared, "As long as Berlin holds out and withstands a siege in the ruins, as it may easily do, German resistance will be stimulated. The fall of Berlin might cause nearly all Germans to despair." While agreeing in principle with the arguments of his chiefs of staff, Churchill felt they had brought into their objections many minor extraneous matters. He pointed out that Eisenhower's credit with the U.S. Chiefs of Staff stands very high. The Americans will feel that, as the victorious Supreme Commander, he had a right, and indeed a vital need, to try to elicit from the Russians the best point for making contact by the armies of the West and of the East. The British protest, Churchill feared, would only provide argumentative possibilities to the U.S. Chiefs of Staff. He expected them to riposte heavily, and they did. On Saturday, March 31st, the American military chiefs gave Eisenhower their unqualified support. They agreed with the British on only 2 points: that Eisenhower should amplify his plans for the combined Chiefs of Staff, and that additional details to Dean should be held up. In the view of the U.S. chiefs, the Battle of Germany is now at the point where the commander in the field is the best judge of the measures which offer the earliest prospect of destroying the German armies or their power to resist. General Eisenhower should continue to be free to communicate with the commander-in-chief of the Soviet army. To the American military leaders there was only one aim, and it did not include political considerations. The single objective, they said, should be quick and complete victory. Still, the controversy was far from over. In Reims, a harassed Eisenhower was still explaining and re-explaining his position. During the day, following Marshall's instructions, Eisenhower sent the combined Chiefs of Staff a long and detailed exposition of his plans. Next, he cabled Moscow and ordered Dean to withhold from Stalin the additional information sent from Schaeff. After that, he assured Marshall in still another message, "You may be sure that, in future, policy cables passing between myself and the military mission in Moscow will be repeated to the combined Chiefs of Staff and the British." And finally, he came to Montgomery's still unanswered plea, which had arrived nearly 48 hours before. It was more than the urgency of his previous cables that caused Eisenhower to answer Montgomery last. Relations between the two men had become so strained that Eisenhower was now communicating with the Field Marshal only when absolutely necessary. As the Supreme Commander explained years later, Montgomery had become so personal in his efforts to make sure that the Americans, and me in particular, got no credit, that in fact we hardly had anything to do with the war, that I finally stopped talking to him. The Supreme Commander and his staff, including, interestingly, the senior British generals at Schaeff, saw Montgomery as an egocentric troublemaker who in the field was overcautious and slow. Monty wanted to ride into Berlin on a white charger wearing 2 hats, recalled British Major General John Whiteley, Schaiff's deputy operations chief. But the feeling was that if anything was to be done quickly, don't give it to Monty. Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, Schaiff's deputy chief of staff, put it another way. At that moment, Monty was the last person Ike would have chosen for a drive on Berlin. Monty would have needed at least 6 months to prepare. Bradley was a different sort. Bradley, Eisenhower told his aide, has never held up, never paused to regroup when he saw an opportunity to advance. Now, Eisenhower's anger over the criticism of his cable to Stalin, coupled with his long-standing antagonism toward Montgomery, was clearly reflected in his reply to the Field Marshal. It exuded annoyance. "I must adhere," it said, "to my decision about 9th Army passing to Bradley's command. As I have already told you, it appears from this distance that an American formation will again pass to you at a later stage for operations beyond the Elbe. You will note that in none of this do I mention Berlin. That place has become, as far as I am concerned, nothing but a geographical location, and I have never been interested in these. My purpose is to destroy the enemy's forces. Even as Eisenhower was making his position evident to Montgomery, Churchill at Chequers was writing the Supreme Commander a historic plea. It was in nearly every respect the antithesis of Eisenhower's words to Montgomery. A little before 7 p.m., the Prime Minister wired the Supreme Commander, "If the enemy's position should weaken, as you evidently expect, why should we not cross the Elbe and advance as far eastward as possible? This has an important political bearing, as the Russian army seems certain to enter Vienna and overrun Austria. If we deliberately leave Berlin to them, even if it should be in our grasp, the double event may strengthen their conviction, already apparent, that they have done everything. Further, I do not consider myself that Berlin has lost its military, and certainly not its political significance. The fall of Berlin would have a profound psychological effect on German resistance in every part of the Reich. While Berlin holds out, great masses of Germans will feel it their duty to go down fighting. The idea that the capture of Dresden and the juncture with the Russians there would be a superior gain does not commend itself to me. Whilst Berlin remains under the German flag, it cannot, in my opinion, fail to be the most decisive point in Germany. Therefore, I should greatly prefer persistence in the plan on which we crossed the Rhine, namely that the 9th U.S. Army should march with the 21st Army Group to the Elbe and beyond to Berlin. In Moscow, as darkness fell, the American and British ambassadors, together with Dean and Archer, met with the Soviet Premier and delivered Eisenhower's message. The conference was brief. Stalin, as Dean later reported to the Supreme Commander, was impressed with the direction of the attack in central Germany, and he thought Eisenhower's main effort was a good one, in that it accomplished the most important objective of dividing Germany in half. He felt, too, that the Germans' last stand would probably be in western Czechoslovakia and Bavaria. While approving of Anglo-American strategy, Stalin was non-committal about his own. The final coordination of Soviet plans, the Premier said, would have to wait until he had a chance to consult with his staff. At the conclusion of the meeting, he promised to reply to Eisenhower's message within 24 hours. Moments after his visitors left, Stalin picked up the phone and called Marshals Zhukov and Konev. He spoke tersely, but his orders were clear. The two commanders were to fly to Moscow immediately for an urgent conference the following day, Easter Sunday. Although he did not explain the reason for his orders, Stalin had decided that the Western Allies were lying. He was quite sure Eisenhower planned to race the Red Army for Berlin. Churchill had shown this Russian note to Eisenhower on March 24th, and the Supreme Commander, he later wrote, seemed deeply stirred with anger at what he considered most unjust and unfounded charges about our good faith. Eisenhower's 1000-word cable does not appear in the official histories, and the version in his own crusade in Europe has been cut and edited. For example, the phrase "always shouted to me" has been changed to "always emphasized," while the angry last paragraph cited above has been dropped altogether. Ironically, the cable was originally drafted by a Britisher, SHAEF's Deputy Operations Chief, Major General John Whiteley, but by the time it left headquarters, it bore Eisenhower's clear imprint. In a long and detailed taped interview with the author, although he was gifted with a brilliant imagination and a natural flair for command, he might have remained a relatively unknown officer but for Stalin's brutal purging of the Red Army's generals in the 30s. Most of those purged were veterans of the revolution, but Zhukov, possibly because he was more army than party, escaped. The ruthless removal of the old guard sped up his promotion. By 1941, he had risen to the highest military job in the USSR, Chief of the Soviet General Staff. Zhukov was known as the soldier's soldier. Perhaps because he had once been a private himself, he had a reputation for leniency with enlisted men. So long as his troops fought well, he considered the spoils of war no more than their just deserts. But with his officers, he was a harsh disciplinarian. Senior commanders who failed to measure up were often fired on the spot and then punished for failing. The punishment usually took one of two forms. The officer was either sent to join a penal battalion or ordered to serve on the most exposed part of the front line as a private. Sometimes he was given a choice. Once, during the Polish campaign of 1944, Zhukov stood with Marshal Konstantin Rokossovski and General Pavel Batov, commander of the 65th Army, watching the troops advance. Suddenly Zhukov, viewing the scene through binoculars, yelled at Batov, "The Corps Commander and the commander of the 44th Rifle Division, Penal Battalion!" Both Rokossovski and Batov began to plead for the two generals. Rokossovski was able to save the Corps Commander, but Zhukov remained firm regarding the second officer. The general was immediately reduced in rank, sent to the front lines, and ordered to lead a suicidal attack. He was killed almost instantly. Zhukov thereupon recommended Russia's highest military award, Hero of the Soviet Union, for the fallen officer. Zhukov himself was a hero of the Soviet Union thrice over, as was his arch-competitor Konev. Honours had been heaped on both marshals, but while Zhukov's fame had spread throughout the USSR, Konev remained virtually unknown, and the anonymity rankled. Konev was a tall, gruff, vigorous man with a shrewd twinkle in his blue eyes. He was 48 years old, a year younger than Zhukov, and in some respects his career had paralleled Zhukov's. He too had fought for the Tsar, crossed over to the revolutionaries, and continued to serve with the Soviet forces. But there was one difference, and to men like Zhukov, it was a big one. Konev had come into the Red Army as a political commissar, and, although he switched to the command side in 1926 and became a regular officer to other soldiers, his background was forever tainted. Political officers had always been heartily disliked by the regular military. So powerful were they that a commander could not issue an order unless it was countersigned by the ranking commissar. Zhukov, though a loyal party man, had never regarded former commissars as true army professionals. It had been a constant irritant to him that in the pre-war years he and Konev had commanded in the same theatres and had been promoted at about the same pace. Stalin, who had hand-picked them both for his cadre of young generals in the 30s, was cannily aware of the intense rivalry between the men. He had made it a point to play one off against the other. Konev, despite his rough, outspoken manner, was generally regarded by the military as the more thoughtful and better educated of the two. A voracious reader, he kept a small library at his headquarters and occasionally surprised his staff by quoting passages from Turgenev and Pushkin. The rank and file of his armies knew him as a stern disciplinarian, but unlike Zhukov, he was considerate of his officers, reserving his wrath for the enemy. On the battlefield, he could be barbarous. During one phase of the Dnieper campaign, after his troops had surrounded several German divisions, Konev demanded their immediate surrender. When the Germans refused, he ordered his sabre-wielding Cossacks to attack. "We let the Cossacks cut for as long as they wished," he told Milovan Djilas, head of the Yugoslav military mission to Moscow in 1944. "They even hacked off the hands of those who raised them to surrender." In this respect, at least, Zhukov and Konev saw eye to eye. They could not forgive Nazi atrocities. For Germans, they had neither mercy nor remorse. Now, as the two marshals walked along the second-floor corridor towards Stalin's suite of offices, both were reasonably certain that the matter to be discussed was Berlin. Tentative plans called for Zhukov's first Belarusian group of armies in the centre to take the city, Marshal Rokossovski's second Belarusian forces to the north, and Konev's first Ukrainian army group on the south could be called in to help. But Zhukov was determined to take Berlin by himself. He had no intention of asking for assistance, especially not from Konev. Konev, however, had been giving Berlin a lot of thought himself. Zhukov's forces could be held up by terrain, especially in the heavily defended Silo Heights region lying just beyond the western banks of the Oder. If that happened, Konev thought he saw a chance to steal Zhukov's thunder. He even had a rough scheme of action in mind. Of course, everything would depend on Stalin, but this time Konev fervently hoped to beat out Zhukov and reap long-awaited glory. If the opportunity presented itself, Konev thought that he just might race his rival for Berlin. Midway along the red-carpeted corridor, the escorting officers ushered Zhukov and Koniev into a conference room. It was high-ceilinged, narrow, and almost filled by a long, massive, highly polished mahogany table surrounded by chairs. Two heavy chandeliers with clear, unfrosted bulbs blazed over the table. At an angle in one corner was a small desk and leather chair, and on the wall nearby hung a large picture of Lenin. The windows were draped, and there were no flags or insignia in the room. There were, however, chrome lithographs, in identical dark frames, of two of Russia's most famous military technicians, Catherine II's brilliant Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov and General Mikhail Kutuzov, who had destroyed Napoleon's armies in 1812. At one end of the room, double doors led to Stalin's private office. The marshals were not unfamiliar with the surroundings. Zhukov had worked down the hall when he was Chief of Staff in 1941, and both men had met here with Stalin many times before. But this conference was not to be a small private session. Within minutes after the two marshals entered the room, they were followed by the 7 most important men after Stalin in the wartime USSR, the members of the State Defense Committee, the all-powerful decision-making body of the Soviet war machine. Without formality or deference to rank, the Soviet leaders filed into the room. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav M. Molotov, the committee's deputy chairman, Lavrenti P. Beria, the thick-set, myopic chief of the secret police and one of the most feared men in Russia, Georgy M. Malenkov, the rotund secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and military procurement administrator, Anastas Versmikoyan, thin-faced and hawk-nosed, the production coordinator, Marshal Nikolai A. Bulganin, the distinguished-looking, goateed Supreme Headquarters representative to the Soviet fronts, stolid, mustachioed Lazar M. Kaganovich, transportation specialist and the lone Jew on the committee, and Nikolai A. Voznesensky, the economic planner and administrator. Representing the operational side of the military were the Chief of the General Staff, General A. Antonov, and the operations chief, General S. M. Shtemenko. As the top Soviet leaders took their chairs, the doors to the Premier's office opened, and the short, stocky figure of Stalin appeared. He was simply dressed in a mustard-coloured uniform, without epaulettes or rank insignia. His trousers, each seamed with a thin red stripe, were tucked into soft, black, knee-length boots. On the left side of his tunic, he wore a single decoration, the red-ribboned gold star of a hero of the Soviet Union. Clamped in his teeth was one of his favourite pipes, a British Dunhill. He wasted little time in formalities. As Koniev was later to recall, "We barely managed to greet each other before Stalin began to talk." Stalin asked Zhukov and Koniev a few questions about conditions on the front. Then abruptly he got to the point. In his low voice, characterized by the peculiar sing-song accent of Georgia, he said quietly and with great effect, "The Little Allies, Soyuznichki, intend to get to Berlin ahead of the Red Army." He waited a moment before continuing. He had received information about Anglo-American plans, Stalin said, and it was clear that their intentions are less than allied. He did not mention Eisenhower's message of the night before, nor did he give any other source for his information. Turning to General Shtemenko, he said, "Read the report." Shtemenko stood up. Eisenhower's forces planned to surround and destroy the Ruhr concentrations of the enemy, he announced, then advance to Leipzig and Dresden. But just on the way, they intended to take Berlin. "All of this," said the general, "will look like helping the Red Army." But it was known that taking Berlin before the arrival of Soviet troops was Eisenhower's main aim. Furthermore, he intoned, it had been learned by the Stavka, Stalin's supreme headquarters, that 2 Allied airborne divisions are being rapidly readied for a drop on Berlin. Koniev, in his version of the meeting, was later to remember that the Allied plan, as described by Shtemenko, also included a drive by Montgomery, north of the Ruhr, along the shortest route separating Berlin from the basic groupings of the British forces. Shtemenko finished, Koniev recalled, by saying that according to all the data and information, this plan, to take Berlin earlier than the Soviet army, is looked upon at the Anglo-American headquarters as fully realistic and that preparation for its fulfillment is in full swing. As Stemenko ended the military evaluation, Stalin turned to his two marshals. "So," he said softly, "who will take Berlin, we or the Allies?" Konev later remembered proudly that he was the first to answer. "We will," he said, "and before the Anglo-Americans." Stalin looked at him, a slight smile flickering over his face. "So," he said again softly. With ponderous humour he added, "Is that the sort of fellow you are?" Then, in an instant, as Konev remembers, Stalin was once more cold and businesslike, stabbing out questions. Exactly how was Konev, on the south, prepared to capture Berlin in time? "Wouldn't a great regrouping of your forces be necessary?" he asked. Too late, Konev saw the trap. Stalin was up to his old tricks again, pitting one man against the other. But by the time he realized this, Konev had already begun to answer. "Comrade Stalin," he said, "all the measures needed will be carried out. We shall regroup in time to take Berlin." It was the moment Zhukov had waited for. "May I speak?" he asked quietly, almost condescendingly. He did not wait for an answer. "With due consideration," he said, nodding to Konev, "the men of the First Belarusian Front need no regrouping. They are ready now. We are aimed directly at Berlin. We are the shortest distance from Berlin. We will take Berlin." Stalin looked at the two men in silence. Once again a smile showed briefly. "Very well," he said mildly. "You will both stay in Moscow and with the General Staff prepare your plans. I expect them ready within 48 hours. Then you can return to the front with everything approved." Both men were shocked by the brief time period allotted for the preparation of their plans. Up to now, they had understood that the target date for attacking Berlin was early May. Now Stalin obviously expected them to attack weeks earlier. To Konev in particular, this was a sobering thought. Although he had a tentative plan that he believed would get him into Berlin before Zhukov, he had nothing on paper. The meeting now made him desperately aware of immense logistical problems that he must solve quickly. All kinds of equipment and supplies would now have to be rushed to the front. Worse, Konev was short of troops. After the fighting in Upper Silesia, a considerable part of his forces was still spread out to the south. Some were miles from Berlin. These would have to be transferred immediately, posing a major transportation problem. Zhukov, listening to Stalin speak, was equally worried. Although his staff officers had been preparing for the attack, he was far from ready. His armies were in position, but he too was still bringing up supplies and rushing replacements to the front to fill out his badly depleted forces. Some of his divisions, usually 9,000 to 12,000 men strong, were down to 3,500. Zhukov believed the Berlin operations would be enormously difficult, and he wanted to be ready for every eventuality. His intelligence had reported that the city itself and its environs have been carefully prepared for stubborn defence. Each street, square, crossroad, house, canal and bridge is a component part of the overall defence. Now, everything would have to be speeded up if he was to beat the Western forces to Berlin. How soon could he attack? That was the question Stalin wanted answered, and quickly. As the meeting broke up, Stalin spoke once again. There was no warmth in his voice. To the two marshals, he said with great emphasis, "I must tell you that the dates of the beginning of your operations will attract our special attention." The rivalry between the two commanders, never far beneath the surface, was being exploited once again. With a brief nod to the men around him, Stalin turned and left the room. Having set his plans in motion, the Soviet Premier still faced one important task, the careful detailing of an answer to Eisenhower's cable. Stalin began work on the prepared draft. By 8 p.m., his reply was finished and dispatched. "I have received your telegram of March 28th, Stalin wired Eisenhower. "Your plan to cut the German forces by joining with Soviet forces entirely coincides with the plan of the Soviet High Command." Stalin fully agreed that the link-up should be in the Leipzig-Dresden area, for the main blow of the Soviet forces would be made in that direction. The date of the Red Army's attack? Stalin gave that particular notice. It would be approximately the second half of May. The most important part of his message came in the third paragraph. There he implanted the impression that he had no interest in Germany's capital. Berlin, he stated, has lost its former strategic importance. In fact, Stalin said, it had become so unimportant that the Soviet High Command therefore plans to allot secondary forces in the direction of Berlin. Winston Churchill had conferred with the British Chiefs of Staff nearly all afternoon. He was feeling embarrassed and upset. His embarrassment stemmed from an Eisenhower message that had been garbled in transmission. One sentence in the cable Churchill received had read, "Montgomery will be responsible on patrol tasks." Sharply, Churchill had replied that he thought His Majesty's forces were being relegated to an unexpected restricted sphere. The bewildered Eisenhower had wired back, "I am disturbed, if not hurt. Nothing is further from my mind, and I think my record should eliminate any such idea." It turned out that Eisenhower had never used the words "on patrol tasks." He had said, "on these tasks," and somehow the expression had been transmitted incorrectly. Churchill was chagrined by the incident, which, trivial though it was, had compounded the mounting confusion. Far from trivial, in the Prime Minister's eyes, was the continuing American apathy toward Berlin. With the tenacity that had characterized him all his life, he now took on both problems, Allied relations and Berlin, at once. In a long telegram to the ailing Roosevelt, his first to FDR since the beginning of the SCAF 252 controversy, the Prime Minister first recorded at length his complete confidence in Eisenhower. Then, having disposed of these misunderstandings between the truest friends and allies that have ever fought side by side, Churchill hammered away at the urgency of taking the German capital. Nothing will exert a psychological effect of despair upon German forces equal to that of the fall of Berlin, he argued. It will be the supreme signal of defeat. If the Russians take Berlin, will not their impression that they have been the overwhelming contributor to the common victory be unduly imprinted in their minds, and may this not lead them into a mood which will raise grave and formidable difficulties in the future? I therefore consider that from a political standpoint, should Berlin be in our grasp, we should certainly take it. The following day, Churchill's concern deepened still more when he received a copy of Stalin's message to Eisenhower. Its contents, the Prime Minister believed, were highly suspicious. At 10:45 that night, he cabled Eisenhower, "I am all the more impressed with the importance of entering Berlin, which may well be open to us, by the reply from Moscow to you, which in paragraph 3 says Berlin has lost its former strategic importance." This should be read in the light of what I mentioned of the political aspects. Churchill added fervently that he now deemed it highly important that we should shake hands with the Russians as far to the east as possible. Despite everything, Churchill's determination to win Berlin had not flagged. He was still optimistic. He ended his message to Eisenhower, "Much may happen in the West before the date of Stalin's main offensive." His great hope now was that the momentum and enthusiasm of the Allied drive would carry the troops forward into Berlin well ahead of Stalin's target date. At Stalin's headquarters, Marshals Zhukov and Konev had worked around the clock. By Tuesday, April 3rd, within the 48-hour deadline, their plans were ready. Once again, they saw Stalin. Zhukov gave his presentation first. He had been considering the attack for months, and the projected moves of his massive First Belarusian group of armies were at his fingertips. His main attack would take place in the pre-dawn, he said, from the 44-kilometre-long bridgehead over the Oder west of Kustrin, directly opposite Berlin. Additional attacks on the north and south would support this stroke. The logistics of the Zhukov plan were staggering. No less than 4 field and 2 tank armies would be thrown into his main thrust, and 2 armies each would be employed for the supporting assaults. Including secondary forces coming up behind, he would have 768,100 men. Leaving nothing to chance, Zhukov hoped to secure for the Kustrin bridgehead a minimum of 250 artillery pieces for each kilometre, approximately one cannon for every 13 feet of front. He planned to open his assault with a stupefying barrage from some 11,000 guns, not counting smaller caliber mortars. Now he came to his favourite part of the plan. Zhukov had devised an unorthodox and bizarre stratagem to befuddle the enemy. He would launch his offensive in the hours of darkness. At the very instant of attack, he intended to blind and demoralize the Germans by turning upon them the fierce glare of 140 high-powered anti-aircraft searchlights beamed directly at their positions. He fully expected his plan to result in massacre. Konev's plan was equally monumental and, fed by his burning ambition, more complex and difficult. As he was later to say, "Berlin for us was the object of such ardent desire that everyone, from soldier to general, wanted to see Berlin with their own eyes, to capture it by force of arms. This too was my ardent desire. I was overflowing with it. But the fact was that at their closest point, Konev's forces were more than 75 miles from the city. Konev was counting on speed to see him through. Craftily, he had massed his tank armies on the right, so that when a breakthrough was achieved, he could wheel northwest and strike out for Berlin, perhaps slipping into the city ahead of Zhukov. This was the idea he had been nurturing for weeks. Now, in light of Zhukov's presentation, he hesitated to tip his hand. Instead, for the moment, he stuck to operational details. His plans called for a dawn attack across the Neisse, under the protection of a heavy smoke screen laid down by low-flying squadrons of fighter planes. Into the assault, he planned to hurl 5 field and 2 tank armies, 11,700 men. Remarkably, he was requesting the same almost incredible artillery density as Zhukov, 250 guns per kilometre of front, and he meant to get even greater use from them. "Unlike my neighbour," Konev recalled, "I planned to saturate the enemy positions with artillery fire for 2 hours and 35 minutes. But Konev badly needed reinforcements. Whereas Zhukov had 8 armies along the Oder, Konev, on the Neisse, had a total of only 5. To put his plan into effect, he needed 2 more. After some discussion, Stalin agreed to give him the 28th and 31st Armies because the fronts have been reduced in the Baltic and East Prussia. But much time might elapse before these armies would reach the First Ukrainian Front, Stalin pointed out. Transport was at a premium. Konev decided to gamble. He could begin the attack while the reinforcements were still en route, he told Stalin, then commit them the moment they arrived. Having listened to the 2 propositions, Stalin now approved them both. But to Zhukov went the responsibility of capturing Berlin. Afterward, he was to head for the line of the Elbe. Konev was to attack on the same day as Zhukov, destroy the enemy along the southern fringes of Berlin, and then let his armies flood west for a meeting with the Americans. The Third Soviet Army Group, Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusians, massing along the lower Oder and all the way to the coast north of Zhukov, would not be involved in the Berlin assault. Rokossovsky, with 314,000 men, would attack later, driving across northern Germany for a link-up with the British. Together, the 3 Russian army groups would have a total of 1,593,800 men. It appeared that Konev had been relegated to a supporting role in the Berlin attack. But then, leaning over the map on the table, Stalin drew a dividing line between Zhukov's and Konev's army groups. It was a curious boundary. It began east of the Russian front, crossed the river, and ran straight to the 16th-century town of Lublin on the Spree, approximately 65 miles southeast of Berlin. There, Stalin suddenly stopped drawing. Had he continued the line right across Germany, thereby marking a boundary that Konev was not to cross, the First Ukrainian armies would clearly have been denied any participation in the Berlin attack. Now Konev was elated. Although Stalin did not say anything, he recalled later, the possibility of a show of initiative on the part of the command of the front was tacitly assumed. Without a word being spoken, the green light to Berlin had been given to Konev's forces, if he could make it. To Konev, it was as though Stalin had read his mind. With what he was to term this secret call to competition on the part of Stalin, the meeting ended. Immediately, the marshal's plans were incorporated into formal directives. The next morning, the rival commanders, orders in hand, drove out in a swirling fog to Moscow airport, each eager to reach his headquarters. Their orders called for them to mount the offensive a full month earlier than the date Stalin had given Eisenhower. For security reasons, the written directives were undated, but Zhukov and Konev had been given the word by Stalin himself. The attack on Berlin would begin on Monday, April 16th. Even as Zhukov and Konev began feverishly preparing to hurl 13 armies with more than 1 million men at Berlin, Adolf Hitler had another of his famous intuitive flashes. The massing of the Russian armies at Kustrin, directly opposite the capital, was nothing more than a mighty feint, he concluded. The main Soviet offensive would be aimed at Prague in the south, not at Berlin. Only one of Hitler's generals was gifted with the same insight. Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner, now commander of Army Group Center on Heinrich's southern flank, had also seen through the Russian hoax. "My Führer," warned Schörner, "it is written in history. Remember Bismarck's words, 'Whoever holds Prague holds Europe.'" Hitler agreed. The brutal Schörner, a Führer favorite and among the least talented of the German generals, was promptly promoted to field marshal. At the same time, Hitler issued a fateful directive. On the night of April 5th, he ordered the transfer south of 4 of Heinrich's veteran panzer units, the very force Heinrich had been depending on to blunt the Russian drive. Russian quotes not otherwise attributed, like other Soviet material used throughout the book, were obtained during a research trip to Moscow in April 1963. The Soviet government allowed the author, assisted by Professor John Ericsson of the University of Manchester, to interview participants, from marshals to privates, in the battle for Berlin. For a full list of names, see the appendix. The only Soviet marshal the author was prohibited from interviewing was Zhukov. The others, Konev, Sokolovsky, Rokossovsky, and Chuikov, each contributed an average of 3 hours of private conversations. In addition, the author was given access to military archives and allowed to copy and take out of Russia voluminous documentation, including battle maps, after-action reports, monographs, photographs, and military histories, hitherto circulated only within Soviet government circles, as comma, of course, they were. Stalin's crucial conference with his marshals is well known to the upper echelon of the Soviet military, although it has never before been published in the West. A number of versions have appeared in Russian military histories and journals. One such is Zhukov's account of the meeting to his staff officers, as recorded by the Russian historian Lieutenant General N.N. Popiel. Marshal Konev explained the background of the conference to the author and supplied details hitherto unknown. He also recounts part of the details in the first part of his memoirs, published in Moscow in 1965.